Welcome everybody, and we are going to do our first lecture. This week we're going to talk about a variety of things. Not only will we be starting fairy tales, but we're going to start at the very, very beginning, which is the concept of a child. So we're talking about children's literature, but who is this genre really created for in our culture? And what I want you to see is that the literature that we still perpetuate today, as far as fairy tales go, and those basic tropes, we see that these ideas and these ideals are continuously perpetuated in our culture, even though when these tales were created, they were created for a much different purpose. And they were also created for children. Well, actually, initially they weren't created for children, but then they were appropriated to children who were considered very different from how we consider children today. So that's just a quick overview of what I'll be talking about in this lecture. So let's begin. To teach or entertain. So this is the study of children's literature, and we're looking at a few concepts here. We're looking at orality and didacticism. So orality refers to the fact that these tales did not start off written down. They started off being spoken. So they're an oral history, so to speak. And so you know how oral history can change, can be modified according to culture, language, etc. Didacticism is referring to the idea of teaching something through literature. Today, we don't really prize didacticism nearly as highly as cultures did in the past, in previous time periods when children were seen more as little adults rather than, you know, a child, which is something that in our culture we observe as something very, very unique. And when I say in our culture, I'm meaning in our time right now, in our cultural space at this particular period in history. So we're studying children's literature, and this should raise the initial question, well, two initial questions actually. The first of which is, what is literature? What is literature? So one thing that we're going to do in this course is create our own canon. I'm getting a lot of vocabulary words right now, but canon. So when I'm speaking of literature, I'm speaking of things written down, recorded over time, passed down, seen as high art, right? Children's literature is really, from people within the industry, is seen as high art. It's something that's inherently difficult to create. It's very hard to create for children because children are an unbelievably honest audience. They are, so they'll let you know straight away what they like, what they do not like. Children are, they're so different and largely the same, much like us, right? So there are certain lessons, certain characters that will just resonate with children more than others. It's incredibly difficult to take something that is complex and put that idea into a simplified form, which would be something equivalent to like a picture book. You know, it's really a special art form to create something for young children, especially something that will hold their attention, something that will move them, that will intrigue them, that will amuse them, entertain them, teach them. So when I say what is literature, it's the stuff that we've prized, that we have passed down through generations, and the things that have lasted the test of time. That's what we put in the literary canon. So the canon is like this cove of all of the books that if you were a child in America from this year to this year, then you have read X number of books. You've read these particular titles. So there are certain titles that I'll mention that will be familiar to you. It may not be one book in particular, but you've all read Little Red Riding Hood, right? You know that story. You know about the big bad wolf. You know about Beauty and the Beast, right? You know about all of the Disney characters, right? It's so ingrained in our culture. You know about Harry Potter. Whether you've read it or not is another story. Now, personally, I didn't grow up with Harry Potter. Okay, I didn't have that privilege. So I didn't get to grow up as a 10-year-old and wait for my owl to come and deliver my invitation letter to Hogwarts. But I know that I have a 2.5-year-old son. I know that he will. I know that he will, and I'll get to live that with him. So I'm looking forward to that. But I know of Harry Potter. I've read the books. I've seen the movies. And it's not just because I teach this, and it's not just because I'm an actual children's author. When I was in college, I discovered the Harry Potter series because my roommate read them, and she said, "You haven't read Harry Potter? You're bookish. You're a book person. You've got to read these." So I started reading them, and then I couldn't put them down, and I read through them. It was my summer of freshman year. And I read through the entire series. I couldn't put the books down. I had to read one right after the other. And I caught up, and then I waited for the last few books to be released, and then I read those. So when I say literature, that's what I'm referring to. When I say canon, that's what I'm referring to. The stories that, you know that you've read Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs, for example. If you've read Madeline, Madeline might be a little niche, but Madeline was one of my favorite series. If you've read any of those books, I guess now it would be, Diary of a Wimpy Kid, for instance. Harry Potter would definitely be one of them for middle grade to older kids. All of these books, the books that we give the highest awards to also are in the canon. So yeah, I hope that gives you a good idea, but I'll speak more about that a little bit later. The next question that this should raise for you is, what is a child? So what does it mean to be a kid? What are their qualities? What are their characteristics? So think about this for a moment. Think about the things that we attribute to children that we really don't attribute to adults. Children seem to be a bit freer, right? They seem to be a bit more open. They're innocent, right? All the things about them that we want to protect. Think about all the things about them that we want to foster and encourage, right? Kids know how to dream. They don't necessarily have to be taught that, right? You have to relearn that almost as an adult. But children, the way that we view them, the way we see them as amusing. Kids say the darndest things. But at the same time, it's because they're innocent. They're so open to the world. They're curious. And then think about all of the other things that children can be. They can be selfish, right? They can be very self-centered because their world is the only world that they know. So it's an adult's job to share with them that, hey, there are so many other worlds out there, and it's good to share with other people. It's good to work with other people and be considerate and have manners and, care about other people. We have to teach things like empathy. And so when I ask what is a child is all of those really complicated things and very malleable at that. And I think that that's where children's literature really takes a turn to really shape the child. How much of this is physiological and how much of this is constructed? So this is my way of asking the nature versus nurture question, right? How much of a child is our concept of a child? How much of that is something that is inherently belonging to them? And how much of that, just because of the phase of life, the stage of life that they're in? And then how much of that is kind of impressed upon them because of our society, right? Our American society. So when I say our society, I'm automatically talking about our American society, current day, present time. Why do we study this? There is something so just magically powerful about children's literature because these are the stories that we've told for years. I mean, hundreds of years. Why do we continue telling these very same stories? Do you know how powerful that is? Do you know how powerful J.K. Rowling is and her Harry Potter series? You know, we're going to end the course with Harry Potter, and it's going to take us about 2 weeks to get through it. But really, I could teach a whole course on that alone. I could teach a whole course on the Divergent series. You know, I could teach a whole course on just any major series we could really look at and really delve much more deeply into the nuances and just in the cultural shaping that takes place. So I will talk about that later, but this is part of the reason why we study it. We have to study the stories that we are willing to keep telling one another and to our children. And once we tell them, we're reliving them as well. We're kind of conjuring up the childhood version of ourselves to enjoy the stories once more. We retell them because we enjoy hearing them. Part of it is nostalgia, of course, but there must be something deeper there. I really feel like the study of children's literature and the study of mythology really go hand in hand. I feel like they're very close. So you'll see quite a few mythological references throughout the course. So if you're not familiar with mythology, I'll break it down for you so that you'll be able to see those connections because they're very important. But I think we understand some deeper concepts, not only the history of literature, but the history of ourselves. Ever since we could start talking, ever since we had speech, we started telling stories. And so this is a more in-depth look at why that is. Because our culture has this compulsion to tell the same stories for decades upon decades, and centuries even. The question is why. That's something that we can begin to explore in this course. When we study children's literature, we're studying culture. We're studying the psyche of human beings since we started telling stories, because there are so many familiar motifs that are used. There are so many familiar tropes, and these are concepts that you'll use later on in the course. There are so many familiar types of characters that we recognize when we see them right away. This must be speaking to some deeper need to learn from them and to see them and hear them realized through our speech, through our breath. But more importantly, there's got to be some deeper meaning, some deeper lessons that we're gathering from this literature. It must feed us, in other words, in some way. And so that's something that we are looking at here. What is this and how does this work? As far as what is the concept of a child, there is a record of evolving values and attitudes towards children. How we feel about children now as a culture is so different from how children were considered previously. And so we want to look at why this is so important. You know, what do children represent in a culture? They have their own literature. You know, we develop, this is one of the few, the only genres of literature where it's created for a genre that can't create it for itself, essentially, right? That doesn't create it for itself. There are adults writing for children, not children writing for children. So what do children represent in our culture? And I think a child epitomizes what the culture considers to be of central and enduring value. So the things that we want to pass on because we want to see them continued, the values and ideas that we want to see take life, take wing, and take breath. And childhood is such a special stage in life. I know for myself, I didn't even appreciate my childhood. I don't feel like I did not appreciate it. I don't think any child truly appreciates their childhood until they are out of it, until they're out of their childhood and they no longer have it. Childhood is a state that adults can only reach vicariously through their own personal memories and contact with other children. I know for me, something new was birthed along with my son, and that was me remembering things from my childhood that I had long forgotten about. As a result of this, we want to give children what the best of our childhoods was and protect them from the worst, right? When we relive childhood, we relive it all. We relive the good and the bad, right? So we want to give them something that will make them better than us. Any good parent knows this. You don't want your child to be just like you when they grow up. You want them to be better than you, okay, right? In some way, shape, or form. If you're a good person, you want your child to grow up to be a great person. If you're a great person, you want your child to grow up to be an awesome person. If you're awesome, you want them to be phenomenal, right? You just want more for them. You want to give them more than what you had, just opportunities. I mean, more exposure to the world, to learning, just anything that you can think of that you enjoyed from your childhood. You want your child to have that, and that's why we pass this literature down. But you also want to offer them as much as you possibly can. So we shape children according to how we think they should be. How does this happen, you're asking? I'm glad you asked. Through literature, of course. This is what I mean by didacticism. We teach children how we think they should be through literature. This is teaching them. Here are the lessons. Here are the characters you should be like. Here are the qualities you want to emulate. From its very inception, children's literature has been a way to socialize the child. In fact, the main purpose of children's lit in Western societies was religious instruction initially. And then it moved from that to, we're going to talk about Perrault quite a bit. We're going to talk about Perrault and how he used these tales for amusement in the courts, and then, in the royal courts for the amusement of adults. And then these stories actually captured the values that were important, at the time. And then, of course, they've been changed here and there. But they've been passed on, and these are those same stories: Cinderella, Little Red Riding Hood, so on and so forth. So this presents an opportunity for society to produce future generations to mirror its positive values, sans the faults. We want to recreate the best of ourselves and kind of get rid of the worst of ourselves, right? It's cultural, societal editing. So many of the classics of children's literature come from this period in time called the Golden Age. This was really, I think, the 19th, early 20th centuries. We're looking somewhere between 1860s through World War I. Okay, so looking at the Victorian era, right? So looking from the 1860s through 1918. So the Victorian era happened as like a little overlap. And a lot of the fairy tales that we're going to look at in this course, and the ones that you're familiar with, come from the Victorian area. And that's the Victorian era, not area, era. And that's 1830 to 1900. This is where those stories come from. So first, before we look at the stories, let's look at the Victorian child and what the Victorian child was. So the Victorian era was very different. I think when people think of the Victorian era, the first thing they think of is the architecture, right? The houses. I love houses. I love architecture. So I love looking at different structures and different styles of homes. So I automatically think of Victorian homes. But when you think of Victorian life, though, something very different conjured up there. So for the Victorian child, and just for Victorian people living in the Victorian era, life was defined by wealth or the lack thereof. So we really benefit from this beautiful thing in America called the middle class, right? Where you don't have to be poor, extremely poor, or extremely rich to live a comfortable, happy, life. But what we see though, in the Victorian era is there was no middle class. So there was either rich or poor. You were either rich or poor. So I don't know how many of you in this course are rich, but you were one or the other. So if you're middle class, then in the Victorian era, probably would have been poor. And for the wealthy, the Victorian child looked a certain way. That meant something very specific. A days filled with boredom. There was a very formal routine, a very monotonous routine for children growing up in wealthy households. There was a constant prodding to be proper and polite, to have good manners, and that was considered being a good child. Many Victorian children were raised by a nanny, and this could go one of two ways. Usually there were nannies who loved their job, who were warm and kind to children because they loved children, they enjoyed children, and they really had a bond, like a mother-like bond with the child that they were the nanny for. But then there were also nannies who could be very affectionless, who could be mean, because remember, nannies were unmarried, and they didn't have children of their own. So that could have been a sore spot for some nannies. Some nannies may have relished in the opportunity to be a mother-like figure. The nanny was very much like the mother during this time period. So the nanny taught kids what was proper and what was not. That includes things like manners, how to dress, proper attire, education, so on and so forth. And the communication with parents was pretty rare. And for the poor Victorian child, they were often coming from a large family with, anywhere from 10 to 12 kids. Usually, this family of this size was living in a small house or a single room, sleeping on the floor, essentially. There were no nannies, that's for sure. And they were working long hours. They were working to support themselves and their family. So mills, mines, chimney sweeps, other public jobs, just whatever they had to do to support the family income. And they would start work at about 4 or 5 in the morning, work all day, get home in the evening. And they could actually, for money, be sold by their parents into slavery. And this is where we enter. There's this wonderful documentary, I suppose, in several parts. I think it's about 6 or 7 parts. It's called The Children Who Built Victorian Britain. And I have in these slides, the link is here, but I've given you this in the course in Blackboard as well, in this week's folder. The ones that I think you should explore, I've put in the slides here. So you can, at this point, kind of stop and open up another window if you like in order to check this out. Or we can continue through the lecture, or you can continue through the lecture with me. Of course, I'm going to continue. And you can come back and watch this. But I think in order to get a real sense of what the Victorian child was, I think that this is a really excellent way to show you. And it's so interesting. I think you'll really enjoy it. I've watched all the parts, but there are several parts. So I wanted to just keep this to a minimum for you, to just give you a little taste of what's out there. But if you were wanting to look at this in full duration, I would absolutely encourage it. So to look at part 1, The Children Who Built Victorian Britain, and then also part 3 and part 4. So part 3 starting at 6 minutes and 50 seconds in, and then part 4. Excellent overview of what it could be like. So when I mention here that children could be sold by parents into slavery, it's not that the parents would do it necessarily intentionally. they would think that they'd be sending their kid to maybe be an apprentice somewhere in a mill, and they would lie to the parents and say, "Oh yeah, and it was really child slavery. It was child labor. This is the era out of which child labor laws came from. That happened for a reason, because some children were unknowingly sold into slavery by their parents and treated very poorly and very cruelly. So, in order to understand that better, please do watch The Children Who Built Victorian Britain, those parts that I had selected for you. So during the Victorian era, the child was seen merely as a little adult. Once the idea of the child being a unique other type of being took hold, the genre became tailored to meet these needs. And as a result, we get many of the conventions that we see in children's literature in total. So that's entertainment, right? Children want to be entertained. They like to be entertained. Happy endings. Protagonists that are children themselves and offer a child's perspective. Now, I have to give a caveat to that, because the protagonist doesn't necessarily have to be a child, but we often see that there is a child perspective portrayed by the protagonist in children's literature, or the protagonist is just a child themselves. Simpler language, good versus evil, and the use of fantasy, because today we consider daydreaming and imagination and fantasy, we consider these as positive attributes of a child. But in the Victorian era, that wasn't the case. There was no room really for that. They were expected to be adults, think like adults, and behave like adults. And we know now that children are, far from that. So this has developed into a tension that's still continued today of the desire to teach children, which is didacticism, or the desire to please them, which is to entertain them. So there's this kind of push and pull between didacticism and entertainment in children's literature. There are those who argue that all children's literature is an indoctrination, even when it doesn't appear to be. So the idea here is that there are some who argue that, and this is something that you'll have to decide for yourself and think about yourself as you're reading the selections I've chosen for this course. Really carefully consider what you think the purpose of all of this is. And I think that's what makes children's literature so incredibly powerful, that these stories don't just stay with us in our adult lives, but we play an active role in it doing so by telling the same stories to our children and passing it on. The world of literature intended for children is created by adult perspectives and adult interests, and that's important to remember. It's created based on what we think children like, and that means that we have to have an idea of what we think a child is. And these perspectives and interests address the implied reader, which is often either someone that has just been conjured up by the author themselves, or someone that the author actually knows in real life as a child. Children's literature functions, all of these stories can function as tools of self-criticism and social criticism for adults. And that's really, the social criticism part is really important. We're going to look at Harry Potter and what the implications are there. But one thing that I often speak about, and I tour and speak about this, I go to conferences and I give talks on this, and it's something I'm really passionate about, is diversity and inclusion in children's literature, because it's so important. This is like a recent movement. This is not something that has been, it's not something that has been as prevalent in, even just 10 years ago or 20 years ago. So social criticism is really important to acknowledge here, because it means that we remember, if children's literature is showing us the values of the culture, then we need to be able to see representation for all children, right? Because we value all children, right? And just one more thing, before we delve more deeply into the fables, into the fairy tales, I wanted to just really briefly discuss 3 ways of writing for children, because I think this kind of each author kind of falls into one of these categories at least. So there are 3 ways of writing for children. You can either invent an imaginary child as the audience. So what you imagine a child to be is the author. Or you can write for a specific child that you know, right? So that's very specific because you're writing to this particular child's age and tastes. Or you can write in the genre of children's lit because it's the best art form for something you have to say. Now, I know for me, there's kind of a 4th category, but it's also, I would fall into category number 2 as an author. I'm writing for a specific child. Before I had my own child, I was writing for the child that I used to be, for the things that I knew that I liked as a child, for the lessons that I wanted to learn, for the things that I think I needed to hear as a child. That's what, for my first 2 books, that's where that comes from. When the 3rd technique is used, remember, when you are writing in the genre because it's the best art form for something that you have to say, readers will revisit that story at any age and see value in it. And according to C.S. Lewis, of whom I'm a huge fan, a children's story that is enjoyed only by children is a bad children's story. The good ones last, meaning that you can revisit a children's tale at any point, and then you can also see how prevalent those lessons are. You can see how prevalent those characters are, even from an adult perspective. And those are some of the best ones. Truly, they really are. Now let's look at Perrault. So Charles Perrault was a French bureaucrat, okay? He would, like I said, he would often tell tales in the courts. And he would do this to kind of just amuse the guests, okay? And these were people who, of course, were also wealthy and prominent figures in the kingdom, in the society. And he composed in 1697 Tales of Times Past, and it included some of our classics, like Sleeping Beauty, Little Red Riding Hood, Bluebeard, Cinderella, and Puss in Boots. And so I know that you probably didn't realize that those stories date all the way back to that date. But remember, at that time, he wasn't really composing for children at the time. These were stories that were thought, oh, kids would like this. This would be fun to tell kids. But in the beginning, that really was not the intention. These cautionary tales, as I was saying, were not intended for children at all. But they were later translated into English in 1729, and by the 19th century had become part of the canon of children's literature. So a couple things that we will be able to speak about later. You know, after reading Perrault's versions of these books, think about, these are just things that I want you to think about. You can feel free to speak to this in the discussion boards. You know, how is this version, this older version, how is it different? So the great thing about the book that we're using is that it has multiple versions of the stories from various cultures, and I love that. Because you need to be able to see the variations, right? And you're looking for the commonalities. You're looking for the things that have changed and the things that have not. When you look at all of these older versions, not only Perrault's, but including Perrault's, how is it different from the version that you already know? What is the lesson? What's the lesson in our culture's version? Because that could have very well changed. And then why do you think they're different? Okay, so a little food for thought here, moving forward as you move through this module and you move through the discussion. Check this out. Check this out. Okay,